I'd like to talk briefly about the Meiji Restoration in Japan. This is one of the most profound periods in human history, in that we see a society that has purposefully, radically changed in a way that very few societies ever have voluntarily. The Japanese went from a completely isolated feudal society to a modern industrial superpower in the span of about 30 years. So it's a very transformative period of time, and for that reason, it's extraordinarily interesting and relevant. If you recall, under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan had become completely isolated. The idea was that the country should be closed off to all foreign contact and trade, except for a very small area in Nagasaki where a very small number of Dutch merchants could come and trade goods. So Japan was effectively closed off. Well, the problem with that is that Japan is in a very strategic location, especially if you're a sailor from the US or from Canada or Mexico or South America. Japan is a safe haven for ships crossing the Pacific. And the Japanese had completely banned trade with the outside. Well, the US government ended up forcing the Japanese to open their markets to the outside world. And this helped set in motion a chain of events that would lead to Japan, ironically, going from completely resisting all foreign influences to becoming one of the most Western-influenced non-Western parts of the world. In fact, you can see here with the Emperor Meiji and the Empress Haruka that they have completely adopted Western-style dress. The Emperor Meiji is dressed in a manner that the King of England would have been dressed in, or any other European aristocrat. Same thing with the Empress. This is a symbol of this society's very radical transformation from a traditional feudal society to a leading industrial and military power. In fact, no other society in the history of the world has undergone the kind of radical transformation that Japan did in such a short period of time. So how did this happen? Well, the United States Navy, along with commercial interests from the United States, had grown weary of being kept out of Japanese markets and off Japanese shores. So an American naval officer, Commodore Matthew Perry, in 1854, sailed to Japan with a letter asking them to open their ports and markets to American sailors and goods, particularly for ships that needed refitting or were in an emergency. Well, Perry was rebuffed, so he returned with a very powerful ship and actually bombarded the coast around Edo, the capital, what's now Tokyo. And this bombardment was something that the Japanese were powerless against due to the fact that the Western ships were so superior to anything that they had. So the shogun, the Tokugawa shogun, was forced to open up the country to American trade and to American warships. So what happened is, as a result of this kind of gunboat diplomacy, is that the Japanese people turned against the Tokugawa shogunate in parts of the country out of resentment over his capitulating to what was essentially a foreign military force tying his hands. Here we have a Japanese rendition of the impression that Perry's ship, a black ship, which is what the Japanese called Western military frigates and other ships, the way that this ship, the impression it had on the Japanese mind, this very foreign, alien, menacing, powerful piece of technology. And of course, if you compare it to a Japanese bune, a traditional Japanese warship, which is effectively a floating castle, these are very, very different types of craft. And the Western ship, in this instance the American ship, was 100 times more powerful than anything the Japanese could field at the time. The Tokugawa shogun had no choice but to accept the American sailors, but the Japanese were largely outraged. There was a slogan, Sono Joy, meaning revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. So the idea was that the Japanese would rally around their symbol of national unity, the emperors, who the emperor had been a puppet for 1,000 years, as the country had been ruled by the shoguns, the great samurai military dictators. The idea was that the emperor would restore the country and would get rid of this foreign presence. So over time, people began to rally around the young Meiji emperor, who we recently saw pictured in Western clothing. The idea was that by venerating the emperor, he would then have the divine power to expel these invaders. And of course, we see here this image of a sumo wrestler throwing an American sailor out of Japan. So, pro-imperial forces began to gather among the various samurai clans of the Tokugawa shogunate, and they began to oppose the shogun and seek his ouster from power. And we call the war between the Tokugawa shogunate and these rebel samurai the Boshin War. The southern samurai were pro-emperor and wanted the shogunate gone. The northern samurai were pro-shogun and wanted to restore or to retain the traditional feudal order. Well, the Southerners won, in part due to their reliance on innovative Western weaponry. We're looking in at 1868, 1869. There were many weapons coming out of the United States into Japan during this war, as the U.S. government got rid of much of its military surplus from the American Civil War by selling it to the southern Japanese as they overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate. In fact, we can see in this next image, image of the transition from a samurai horseman to a Tokugawa, late Tokugawa, kind of semi-modern infantryman, to a fully modern 19th century Western-style soldier. And this is a representation of the kind of military power that Japan was experiencing after the Boshin War, when these innovators and modernizers took control of the country in the name of the Meiji Emperor and modernized Japan into an industrial power. With their newfound military power, Japan began to build an empire of their own within a generation. So within one generation of being threatened by Western powers and experiencing something similar to the Opium War that the Chinese experienced, the Japanese were actually not only completely modernized and able to defend themselves from Western empires, they were building their own Western-style empire in Asia, particularly in Korea, which they annexed, and China, which they fought several wars with over the course of the next century. One of the biggest upsets came in 1904, when Japan actually defeated Russia in a war in the Far East. And this was seen as a total shock, because for the first time, a European power had been beaten by a non-European power within a 200-year period. Prior to 200 years earlier, you had numerous powers coming out of Asia into Europe, winning wars. But for 200 years prior to this, generally speaking, it was European powers who had the military advantage, and that suddenly had shifted. The traditional Japanese samurai culture had created a legacy of militarism and of military values that the Japanese were able to carry over into technological warfare. In fact, this is something that would carry all the way into the Second World War, when you had Japanese pilots, for example, engaging in suicide missions called kamikaze. If you remember, kamikaze means divine wind, and it's the name of the storm that wrecked the Mongol fleets both times the Mongols attempted to invade. This is a direct link with modern Japan, with its samurai past. And this aided the Japanese soldiers in battle. One of the reasons that the Japanese were able to defeat the Russians in 1904 was because, first of all, the Russians were in a period of great demoralization. This is only 13 years prior to the Russian Revolution. But the Japanese were masters at using bayonets in modern warfare. They liked to get close up. They believed that European soldiers were squeamish and couldn't take blade-to-blade combat the same way that the Japanese could handle it. And of course, this would have devastating consequences in World War II. Not only did it make for some very bloody attacks, battles, hand-to-hand battles between Japanese and American troops. The Japanese were doing bayonet charges against machine guns and against aircraft and against tanks and modern weaponry that made those tactics particularly costly. The Japanese had come to believe, in part due to their victory over Russia and over China and their rapid modernization, as well as their belief in the divinity of their nation, going back to their resistance against the Mongols, victory over the Mongols. There was this idea that they were invulnerable, that their fighting spirit was so great that any material disadvantage they had, they could easily overcome. They called this spirit over matter. That was their slogan in World War II. The United States had matter, it had industry, it had population twice that of Japan's, and 10 times as much industry, but Japan had fighting spirit, and its men would fight to the last man. And of course, the invasion of Japan that was planned in 1945 was never carried out because of the 2 atomic bombs, which ended World War II. But that mentality in the 1930s in Japan and 1940s has its roots in Japan's great successes. The fact that Japan was able to do what no other nation had been able to do, which was modernize, and within a 45-year period of time actually defeat a European power and get territorial concessions from it. If you look at a map in 1942, you can see the sheer extent of the gains of the Japanese Empire after the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been destroyed at Pearl Harbor and the Japanese had invaded not only the Philippines and northern China, Manchuria, Korea, but also French Indochina, and were threatening British India. So this is one of the most extreme turnarounds in the history of the world. There were people who were born in the Tokugawa shogunate who were elderly when Japan was one of the world's premier military powers. And it really is an extraordinary period of very, very, very rapid adaptation, unprecedented adaptation.